Okay, hello to everybody. We are now having our last section, graduate section indeed. And we have a pleasure to have here with us, sorry for my pronunciation,
That's okay, don't worry.
Chandni Dwarkasing, PhD student at University of Siena. Chandni, welcome to our workshop, and
Thank
please
you.
have the word.
Okay, we'll share the screen now. Well, it's already sharing, but I will open the presentation. Let me know when you see it. Do you see the presentation? Just check the chat. Okay, so it was working. Okay, so I can begin, right? Okay. So good afternoon or good evening to everybody who is joining. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present at this first international workshop of the Structuralist and Development Macroeconomics Research Group. As Luis was saying, I'm actually a recently graduated PhD student from the Universities of Florence, Pisa, and Siena. And now I'm working on a project called Equation, in which I'm focused on the societal barriers for the ecological transition, but in a European context. My research in the dissertation, however, was a bit more theoretical, and it was focused on the formal representation of economy ecology configurations in the field of economics, but more specifically ecological economics. And what I want to present today is a very condensed and short version of the last chapter of my dissertation, in which I try to present a very simple theoretical framework as an alternative to the status quo right now, in which I try to capture this concept of the ecological surplus. It's a work in progress. It's not a finalized paper or anything, so any feedback or comments will be more than appreciated. So in the presentation, this is the outline. First, I'm going to introduce the status quo of formal abstraction in the field of environmental and resource economics and ecological economics. Then I will talk and introduce very shortly and briefly ecological Marxism, which is the field from which I draw this concept of the ecological surplus. Then I will introduce the baseline Neo-Ricardian framework, which is the framework that I adapt in order to represent some eco-Marxist insights concerning economy ecology configurations. These adaptations that I introduced are based on the measure of labor intensity and a formulation of a metabolic parameter, which is my own formulation. And then I will just discuss the result of these adaptations in a very, very simple comparative statics exercise. And then I will conclude and share some thoughts on what I think are some open issues and future further considerations that I need to make. So the present in the field of ecological economics or in economics, the disruption or the degradation of ecological processes is usually treated as an externality, as many of you are familiar with, which is characterized as the unintended impact of production decisions or the organization of production on the level of production itself, on profits or some kind of social welfare. And these externalities imply reductions in economic efficiency. And since the externality is absent from any form of compensation or payment, there is a necessity to internalize these negative externalities. Internalizing these negative externalities will incentivize reorganization of production, reduction in production levels, or investment in technologies which decouple production from its negative impact on ecological degradation. And the internalization of this externality can take various shapes. It can be through the assignment of property rights following Coase's theorem, or introducing taxation or subsidy schemes or tradable permit schemes. Now, ideally, each of these internalization mechanisms will lead to a situation of economic efficiency or allocative efficiency, where ecological degradation or the level thereof is reduced to a Pareto optimal level in which producers are absent of any incentive to deviate from this level. And so usually these internalization mechanisms require the monetary valuation or estimation of relevant ecological processes, and assuming that such an estimation can be achieved and that it is more or less correct, we can formally represent this internalization mechanism as follows. So you have a production process which only considers human-made capital and labor and results in an output and W1. And then after internalization, now natural capital, which represents a resource or ecological process, is taken into account in production and results in an output plus W2. And the idea of internalizing the externality is that, of course, W2 is lower than W1, where W can denote a waste stream, a measure of scarcity of a natural resource, or any other negative impact on an ecological process. Now, this brings us to the dominant abstraction of economy ecology configurations in both environmental and resource economics and ecological economics, where a natural resource stock or an ecological process is represented by natural capital, which enters a production function. And the difference between environmental and resource economics and ecological economics regards the degree of substitutability between human-made capital and natural capital. Where environmental and resource economics abides by this weak sustainability paradigm, which means that they impose substitutability, ecological economics usually abides by the strong sustainability paradigm, which means they impose a limited substitutability and sometimes even complementarity between human-made capital and natural capital. So the leading question in my dissertation was whether I could translate some insights from non-economic fields, such as ecological Marxism, which is more rooted in social sciences, if these insights can be used to come up with a different abstraction process, different from representing ecological processes as those which enter the production function. Now, very briefly, ecological Marxism is a stream of literature which tries to highlight Marx's ecological critique of capitalism, and this is visible in many of his writings on capitalist agriculture, human-nature relationships, and the labor process. And the scholars in the ecological Marxist tradition have predominantly highlighted Marx's assessment of the structural changes in agriculture during the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, in which Marx identified a rupture in the return of the nutrients to the soil due to, on the one hand, the increasing distance between town and country, and on the other hand, the increased reliance of capitalist agriculture on capital investments for the purpose of increasing agricultural productivity. These capital investments are the use of artificial nutrients or fertilizers, which in the long run have led to soil exhaustion. Now, this idea of a rupture in a previously existing metabolism between society and nature has been coined by ecological Marxists as the metabolic rift, and contemporary scholars have then applied this theoretical lens or this concept of the metabolic rift to many contemporary ecological degradations at the hand of the capitalist mode of production. Now, it's important to bear in mind that in the rest of my presentation, I closely follow Marx's original treatment of this metabolic rift in the sphere of agricultural production. Then I will introduce now world ecology, which is a more recent strand of eco-Marxist thought. And it's different from the plain metabolic rift school in that it situates these metabolic rifts not in Great Britain and during the Industrial Revolution, but over a broader historical time period all the way to the 16th century. And it's actually kind of a synthesis between this plain metabolic rift theory and Wallerstein's world system theory. And in doing so, in tracing these ecological disruptions all the way to the 16th century, this is the lead world ecologist at the moment, introduces this theoretical concept called ecological surplus as a way to assess the state of increasing returns or conditions for sustained capital accumulation. This theoretical concept of the ecological surplus is a ratio between the appropriated and the capitalized contributors to production processes, where appropriated contributors are the non-monetized social and ecological reproduction processes, such as domestic work, care work, carbon sink capacity, soil fertility, etc. And the capitalized contributors are what we usually call monetized factors of production, such as wage labor, raw materials, machinery, paid services, etc. So I found the ecological surplus to be a very interesting concept because it accentuates the relevance of appropriated and thus non-monetized contributors to the production process. And it allowed me to kind of interpret the current abstraction process in both environmental and resource economics and ecological economics as one which is restricted to the assessment of capitalized ecological entities, or when monetary valuation has not taken place yet, this kind of formal abstraction proposes capitalization. This is my interpretation. So in other words, there is no regard for the contribution of appropriated ecological processes to production and the conditions for sustained accumulation. So then the question becomes, how can one formalize the contribution of appropriated ecological processes? And for this purpose, I draw on Marx's labor process theory, which is used by eco-Marxists to clarify the idea of this metabolism between society and nature. And I borrow this demarcation by Hahn. He looks at Marxist labor process theory and divides it into two elements: material metabolism, in which labor is seen as a metabolic process which is subject to a physiological or material component grounded in natural sciences and therefore concerned with the material interlinkages between nature and society. And then there's a more abstract component called purpose realization, in which labor is seen as the imposition of human intention on nature, causing nature or ecological processes to capitulate to humanity's will. Purpose realization is also the endowment then of natural objects with humanistic forms for a specific purpose. So against the backdrop of this demarcation of the labor process, I argue that for a given production process that depends on an ecological process, the material metabolism component is orchestrated either by labor, waged workers, or capitalists, and that this distinction depends on whether the ecological process or entity is appropriated or capitalized. Then when it comes to this more abstract component, purpose realization, I argue that when an ecological entity is in its appropriated state, it's endowed with humanistic forms for the purpose of use-value extraction. Instead, in its capitalized state, it is additionally endowed also for the purpose of exchange value accumulation. And so the question then becomes, how can one formalize labor's entanglement with an ecological process? And secondly, how to display this contribution of an appropriated ecological process to production itself. The suggestion that I have in mind that I propose in the dissertation is situated in a Neo-Ricardian macroeconomic framework based on two sectors, in which I take the price of the agricultural commodity as a numeraire, and I treat the wage rate as exogenous because I assume a dual economy with a subsistence sector which dictates the subsistence wage. And so in the following table, you can see a simple representation of the production processes. So the agricultural production process depends on seed input, agricultural commodity itself, industrial commodity and a labor input, and the industrial production process instead only depends on an industrial commodity and a labor input. This doesn't cause any problems because the wage basket consists of the agricultural commodity, and so through the simple system of linear equation, I can derive the relative prices and the rate of profit. So what is my idea of allowing appropriated ecological processes to contribute to the production process? So if I were to abstract from appropriated ecological processes, the production function would take the following shape, which is a simple fixed coefficient Leontief function. Instead, I allow appropriated ecological, not only ecological processes, but also labor processes to influence the technical coefficients in the agricultural sector. So we can see here that the coefficient which dictates the amount of seed that is necessary for production is a function of this metabolic parameter. And above that, when it comes to labor, I allow this kind of appropriation of labor to take place through the measure of labor intensity. Now, in the classical Marxist tradition, labor intensity is the amount of labor expended per hour of production, and it is a key determinant of absolute surplus value extraction or absolute increases in labor exploitation. But we're operating in a Neo-Ricardian framework, so labor exploitation is considered to be redundant for two reasons. First, the existence of a physical surplus already explains positive profits. And secondly, the choice of labor power as the unit of measure to explain exploitation is arbitrary. Since it's already a physicalist framework, any other commodity can be used to tell the same story. Nevertheless, I argue that labor intensity could still be considered as relevant for the purpose of explaining the unique social relationship that exists between capitalists and workers. That is, capitalists are able to reorganize production or simply demand workers to exert more effort per hour of production without necessarily increasing their costs, but increasing their production levels. So this is because increases in the labor intensity decrease labor productivity or improve labor productivity. And so since the wage bill follows the real labor coefficient, it's possible to think of adjustment in labor intensity as increases in labor appropriation. But apart from that, one could also think of the variability in the measure of labor intensity as the result of labor that's being conducted in the sphere of reproduction, such as care and household work. And so in this way, incorporating a measure of labor intensity, even in a Neo-Ricardian framework, it's kind of able to capture an element of social reproduction. However, when we consider the sphere of reproduction, this wouldn't necessarily artificially improve the measure of labor productivity. It could actually also deteriorate the measure of labor productivity. In the rest of the presentation, I will focus on the first labor intensity type, which improves the labor productivity measure. So let's go to the metabolic parameter. So as I said, one of the technical coefficients, in this case, seed, is a function of the metabolic parameter at a previous period in time, t, so it's a lagged variable. And I follow Marx's labor process theory in defining this metabolic parameter that takes a value between 0 and 1, and it's divided in a material component and in a cognitive component, which is meant to capture this abstract idea of purpose realization. Now, the material component is a quadratic function of the wage basket and the labor coefficient, adjusted for labor intensity. And so since this represents the compensation per hour of production, in the original framework of Marx and his description of agricultural production at the time of the Industrial Revolution, this kind of serves as a proxy for the amount of nutrients returned to the soil, relatively to an exogenous optimum, which is n in the following formulation. And the quadratic nature of this function with respect to this material component captures the well-known characteristic of the environmental Kuznets curve, which dictates that higher material well-being leads to increased environmental awareness and so pro-environmental behavior up to a certain turning point. Or coming back to the specific example that I'm dealing with right now, returning an above optimal amount of nutrients to the soil will also result in negative impacts on soil fertility. Then the fact that the material component is also a function of the labor coefficient captures the stylized fact in agricultural production that usually more labor-intensive agricultural practices tend to be more sustainable. Usually it's not always the case, but. And then finally, the other component of this metabolic parameter is this cognitive component, which is simply an inverse function of the measure of labor intensity amplified by this parameter alpha, which simply captures the relative weight of the cognitive component with respect to the material component. So if we look at the full formulation of this metabolic parameter, we see that the positive or negative effect of the material component is diminished or amplified by the cognitive component, but that the material component in and of itself is also moderated by this measure of labor intensity. Then when it comes to the impact on the actual technical coefficient, this is a simple linear formalization in which I impose a maximum to the seed coefficient, which is reached when the metabolic parameter is equal to 0, and the minimum when the metabolic parameter is equal to 1. So in this way, the appropriation of labor and the state of the appropriated ecological process are intrinsically linked to each other, but more importantly, they both affect the production process without being capitalized through the impact on technical coefficients. The only difference between the seed coefficient and the labor coefficient is that capitalists are aware of the impact of the labor intensity increases on the labor coefficient, while they are not aware of the impact on the state of the ecological process, as this is due, the impact is lagged in time. So now I will present very simple comparative static exercise where I try to represent this movement in the ecological surplus and the implications for the profit rate. So the first is the classical Neo-Ricardian example considering fertility. So if we imagine an exogenous increase in soil fertility, like a shift to cultivation on lands of higher fertility, then of course for a given wage rate, this increases the rate of profit because the capitalized seed input is rendered more efficient. And so increase in the ecological surplus results in an increase in the profit rate, the short-term profit rate. But what happens when we increase the labor intensity measure? An exogenous increase in the labor intensity measure for a given wage rate, first, of course, it will increase the rate of profit due to the artificially increased labor coefficient. Unlike pure labor productivity increases, however, this does not increase the maximum wage because this is limited by the normal labor coefficient. In any case, because the ecological process and the labor process are linked to each other, increasing labor intensity renders the soil fertility suboptimal. And so the long-term effect is a decrease in the quality of the appropriated ecological process, which renders the capitalized seed input less efficient and ultimately decreases the ecological surplus and thereby the rate of profit. Then the final example is an exogenous increase in the wage rate, which of course can be seen as an exogenous increase in the capitalized labor. And this lowers the rate of profit, but again, due to the connection between labor and ecological processes through the material component, this may either improve or deteriorate the appropriated ecological process depending on which side of the parabola you are. So it could be that we have already reached the turning point in which an increase in the material component will deteriorate the ecological process, or the other way around, it might improve the ecological process. So now I will shortly conclude. So first of all, this exercise is limited to a very simplified representation of agricultural production and its entanglement specifically with soil fertility as an appropriated ecological process. And there are many open issues and things to consider. For example, the concrete measurement of this ecological surplus and particularly the appropriation component. This is still an open question and something that I'm working on what could data reveal on anything determining appropriated ecological processes, but also labor processes. And then I introduced this kind of ecologically determined technical change. And as you may recall, the seed coefficient is a function of this metabolic parameter at some previous time t. And so this also needs more, I need to think more specifically about this, whether this impact is the time at which this impact occurs, whether it's stochastic, whether it's deterministic, etc. And then more importantly, of course, this example is limited to agricultural production and very close to what Marx has written, which was already 150 years ago. So of course, it's important to think about extrapolation to the broader and more contemporary issue that we are facing right now, which is climate change. And for this, I have some ideas in mind, which is to regard time use surveys and the intensity of the carbon intensity of activities occurring outside of the sphere of production, where my hypothesis is that an engagement, a higher engagement in carbon-intensive activities outside of the sphere of production may reveal, on the one hand, that material well-being has passed this tipping point in the parabola, where more richer households tend to engage in more carbon-intensive leisure activities or transport activities, but it could also reveal that there's a higher measure of labor intensity occurring in the sphere of work, in the sphere of production, and so that exhausting working conditions may have counterintuitive effects on the carbon intensity of activities outside of the sphere of production, in the sphere of reproduction, for example. and that this may render some environmental policies less effective. And then this can also reveal a higher measure of labor intensity in the sphere of reproduction in and of itself. And that was it. Thank you very much.